Toronto was never going to be just another stop on the Rush tour. This is home territory, the city where Rush's story was built, where generations of fans learned these songs, and where every note carries decades of history. So when Anika Nilles walked onto the Scotiabank Arena stage alongside Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson, she wasn't simply playing drums, she was stepping into one of the most scrutinized musical environments in rock. And after 4 sold-out Toronto performances in August 2026, one thing became increasingly difficult to ignore. Anika had demonstrated that she could handle the enormous musical responsibility placed in front of her. That matters because Rush's drum parts are not ordinary rock accompaniment. They demand precision, stamina, independence, dynamics, and the ability to respond to two musicians whose playing is deeply intertwined with a history of progressive rock. And there was an even bigger shadow over the entire experience: Neil Peart. Rush has made it clear that Neil's musicianship was singular and that he was irreplaceable. Anika was never presented as a replacement for him. She was chosen to help Geddy and Alex bring this music back to the stage while creating a new chapter. Toronto, perhaps more than almost anywhere else, was the place where that distinction could be tested. And what happened next told us something important about Anika Nilles. Not about replacing a legend, but about earning her own place inside the music. But Toronto carried another layer of pressure. These were 4 hometown shows at Scotiabank Arena, August 7th, 9, 11, and 13, and the performances were being treated as a major homecoming for Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson. The August 11 concert was especially emotional, with Lee telling the audience, "Words fail me," during the final ovation. For Anika, that meant playing under a spotlight unlike almost anywhere else on the tour. Every transition mattered. Every rhythmic change had to lock into Geddy's bass and Alex's guitar. And because Rush's music is built around intricate arrangements rather than simple drum patterns, the challenge was never merely playing loudly or technically. It was knowing when to push, when to pull back, and when to let the song breathe. That distinction is crucial. Anika's role was not to imitate Neil Peart so perfectly that nobody noticed the difference. It was to understand the architecture of Rush's music deeply enough to perform it with authority while remaining herself. And Toronto gave her a particularly meaningful test. By this point in the 50-something tour, she was no longer an unknown quantity. She had already spent months performing these demanding songs with Lee and Lifeson. But a hometown Rush audience brings a different kind of scrutiny. They know these songs, they know these arrangements, and they know exactly how important the drummer is. That is why Toronto mattered. It wasn't simply another concert stop. It was a musical examination, and Anika had to prove that she belonged on that stage without pretending to be someone she wasn't. And that is where the real story begins. The most revealing part of Anika Nilles' Toronto performances may not have been a single drum fill or one spectacular passage. It was something more fundamental: adaptability. Rush's music changes character constantly. One moment demands restraint and precision. The next requires explosive power. A song can move from a tightly controlled groove into intricate progressive rock passages where every instrument has to occupy its exact space. Anika understood that challenge. In interviews about preparing for the tour, she explained that she approached Neil Peart's parts with respect, while making careful decisions about where she should stay faithful to the originals and where she could bring more of herself into the performance. That philosophy became especially meaningful in Toronto, because the question was never simply, can she play Rush songs? A world-class drummer can learn difficult parts. The harder question was, can she make those parts feel alive while standing beside Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson? The evidence from Toronto suggests she can. Fans attending the hometown shows repeatedly described her playing as powerful, precise, and remarkably well integrated with the band. Independent audience reports should always be treated as personal observations rather than definitive reviews, but the consistency of that reaction is difficult to overlook, and that may be the real breakthrough. Anika wasn't trying to erase Neil Peart's identity from Rush. She was showing that respect for the past and confidence in the present can exist at the same time. For longtime fans, that distinction may be the key to understanding why this reunion works, because Toronto wasn't asking Anika to become Neil. It was asking whether she could become Anika Nilles inside Rush, and on that stage, night after night, she was giving fans a very compelling answer. But there was another reason Toronto mattered so much: these shows were being captured on film. Rush chose all 4 hometown performances at Scotiabank Arena as material for a possible concert film, making this more than a temporary moment on the 50-something tour. What happened in Toronto could become part of the visual record of Rush's return. Think about what that means for Anika. She wasn't simply performing for the people in the building, she was performing during a historic chapter of Rush's story, one that could eventually be watched by fans who weren't even there, and that makes her consistency even more important. The challenge was not to produce one impressive performance. It was to deliver night after night while navigating a demanding set list, changing arrangements, and the emotional weight surrounding Neil Peart's absence. Anika had already spent months proving that she could operate inside this musical language. Toronto showed how naturally she had grown into that responsibility. Even Geddy and Alex have spoken about the chemistry developing between the musicians as the tour progressed, emphasizing that the experience became about more than simply learning the songs. That is a significant distinction, because Rush has always been about chemistry. The magic was never just Geddy's bass, Alex's guitar, or Neil's drums individually. It was the way 3 musicians could anticipate each other, challenge each other, and turn complicated arrangements into something that felt instinctive. Now, decades later, that chemistry has changed. And Toronto provided perhaps the clearest evidence yet that a new musical relationship had formed. Not Neil Peart recreated, not Rush pretending nothing changed, something different, something new. And for fans willing to listen closely, that may be the most important thing Anika Nilles has proved so far. And perhaps the biggest thing Toronto proved is that Anika Nilles has earned something far more important than comparison: trust. That trust matters because Rush's music leaves very little room for hiding. When a drummer is responsible for driving songs this complex, weaknesses eventually become obvious. But the Toronto performances generated strong reactions from people who were hearing the band live for the first time in more than a decade. One fan who attended multiple shows described Anika as powerful, precise, and capable of honoring Neil's parts while still making them her own. That is exactly the balance this new version of Rush needs. Anika does not have to convince anyone that she is Neil Peart. Nobody could be. Instead, she has to convince listeners that the music can move forward without losing its identity. And Toronto suggested that it can. There is something almost poetic about that happening in the city where Rush began. The band returned home carrying an enormous history with them, and Anika stood at the center of the rhythm section, helping carry that history into the present. For longtime fans, that may be difficult to accept emotionally. Neil's absence will always be felt. But respecting Neil does not mean freezing Rush in 2020. It means recognizing what he helped create and appreciating musicians who can carry that music forward with integrity. That is why Anika's performance deserves attention beyond the usual new drummer conversation. She demonstrated confidence without arrogance, technical ability without turning the performance into a demonstration, and individuality without disrespecting the original arrangements. And for those of us who care about how the music is actually made, that distinction matters. We are building a community here for pure rock traditionalists and drum enthusiasts who care about how the music is actually made. Hit subscribe and join the legend crew. Because Toronto may ultimately be remembered as the moment when fans stopped asking whether Anika could handle Rush